Under the dim orange haze of streetlights, the Soundview houses in the South Bronx sat like a sleeping beast, silent, but breathing with tension. In the late 1970s, the Bronx was a landscape of contrasts, children playing tag beside burnt-out cars, grandmothers sitting by cracked windows, the smell of fried food and exhaust mixing in the air. It was a place where dreams were fragile, and danger was never far. For a young boy named Peter Rollack, these blocks were home, but they were also a classroom, teaching lessons the world outside would never understand. The rhythm of the streets, the language of survival, the unspoken codes between hustlers and neighbors, all of it seeped into him like the hum of a lullaby turned dark. In those early years, Pete was like many boys around him, bright-eyed, quick to smile, with a hint of mischief that made elders shake their heads. His mother worked long hours, his father tried to keep food on the table, and the neighborhood itself became a second parent, rough, loud, and unpredictable. Every corner had a story. Some were told through graffiti names scrawled across concrete walls, others through the gunshots that occasionally punctured the night. The Bronx in those days was a storm waiting to happen, and inside it, young Pete learned to listen to the thunder. There was music in the air back then. Hip-hop was just being born in nearby blocks. DJs spun records on park benches, and kids gathered around to freestyle, their words echoing off brick and steel. But where some saw art, others saw opportunity. Dealers worked just steps away from dancers, their movements sharp and cautious. Money changed hands faster than beats dropped, and the lines between survival and sin blurred quickly. Pete watched all of it, the laughter, the violence, the moments of kindness tucked between chaos. To him, it was all normal. To him, it was life. The older boys fascinated him. They walked with confidence, draped in gold chains and fresh sneakers, their cars polished even if the streets around them weren't. They had respect. When they spoke, people listened. Pete saw how fear and admiration could live side by side, how power didn't always come from doing good but from being remembered. In a place where being forgotten was the worst fate of all, he understood early that power meant survival. The first seeds of ambition were sown not in classrooms but in hallways smelling of smoke and paint thinner. Nighttime in Soundview carried its own kind of silence, not peace, but pause. A moment between the chaos of day and the whispers of midnight deals. You could hear the wind rustle through broken fences, the faint hum of a distant train, and sometimes, a shout cut short too quickly. Pete often stayed awake, staring out the window, watching the flicker of passing police cars reflect on the walls. To others, it was fear. To him, it was fascination. He wondered what it felt like to be on both sides of that glass, to chase and to be chased. He didn't know it then, but he would one day live that duality fully. At school, he was restless. Teachers described him as intelligent but distracted, the kind of kid who could do well if only he cared. But the world outside the classroom offered rewards that made sense: money, respect, and belonging. The streets didn't ask for grades or permission slips, they asked only for courage and loyalty. And those were things Pete had in abundance. His early mischief turned into small hustles, running errands for older boys, watching corners, keeping secrets. Nothing major at first, but enough to taste the edge of power. It wasn't about violence yet. It was about being noticed. By his early teens, Pete had already earned a reputation. Not for being the loudest, but for being smart. He observed before he acted, calculated before he spoke. People said he had an old soul, a kind of focus rare for someone his age. In the chaotic ecosystem of the Bronx, that made him stand out. He wasn't a reckless kid chasing trouble, he was a quiet strategist, learning the rules from the inside out. Every argument he witnessed, every fight he avoided, every arrest he saw from afar became another lesson in how to move without being caught. But even the sharpest learners couldn't escape the Bronx's pull forever. Drugs were spreading like wildfire, and violence followed close behind. Families tried to hold on, but poverty was relentless. It crept through walls, filled refrigerators with nothing but air, and turned good intentions into desperate acts. Pete saw friends disappear, some to jail, some to graves, others simply lost to the streets. It hardened him. What began as curiosity slowly turned into conviction. If this was the world he had to live in, he'd rather rule it than fall to it. The Soundview Projects became his kingdom in the making. He watched who controlled what, who owed who, which corners made money and which weren't worth the risk. He understood patterns. He also understood people, how fear could make them obedient, how loyalty could make them dangerous. Even before he carried a gun, Pete carried an aura. The kind that made others pay attention. The kind that made you feel both safe and uneasy in his presence. And yet, beneath it all, there was still that quiet boy looking out the window, dreaming of something more. Maybe he didn't know what more meant, but he knew it wasn't this endless cycle of survival. In his mind, power meant freedom, the ability to control what happened next. He didn't realize then that the pursuit of control would one day chain him tighter than any prison bars ever could. The Bronx at night continued to breathe. The sound of sirens drifted through the distance like lullabies of warning. Mothers whispered prayers for their sons. And somewhere, a young boy named Peter Rollack began walking paths that would eventually lead him far from home, into the heart of power, violence, and legend. For now, he was just another kid in the projects, chasing light in the darkness. But the shadows had already claimed him, quietly, completely, and what would grow from those shadows would change the Bronx forever. The South Bronx in the early 1980s was a living paradox. By day, it pulsed with laughter, games, and the echo of basketballs bouncing off worn concrete courts. By night, it transformed, sirens became lullabies, and street corners flickered like candles in a church of survival. It was here, amid cracked sidewalks and faded murals, that a young Peter Rollack grew from a curious boy into a student of the streets. He wasn't born into privilege or protection. The neighborhood raised him, tested him, and, bit by bit, reshaped him. Every alleyway was a lesson, every argument a test, every hustle a doorway to something larger. Pete loved the court. Basketball was the one escape that felt pure. The thump of the ball, the squeak of sneakers, the rush of competition, it was freedom. On the blacktop, nobody cared who your father was or how much money you had. Respect was earned in motion, in rhythm, in endurance. He wasn't the tallest or the flashiest, but he was quick, deliberate, calm under pressure. Older boys would say, Pete got ice in his veins. That calm would one day become his weapon, but for now, it was just his way of surviving. When the game ended, reality came rushing back, the broken elevators, the smell of gunpowder from the night before, the whispers of another life lost to the block. It was impossible not to notice the men who seemed untouchable. The ones with thick gold ropes around their necks, leather jackets creased just right, and cars that glided through potholes like kings among peasants. Pete watched them closely. He noticed how they spoke, soft but commanding, how people stepped aside when they passed. They weren't afraid of anyone, and for a boy who'd grown up watching his parents struggle just to pay rent, that kind of power looked like magic. Those men weren't ghosts or stories, they were flesh and blood, right there in Soundview, living proof that the street could make you rich and respected if you played your cards right. But there was a darker side too. Pete saw it every day. He saw kids just a few years older than him start slinging vials for fast cash. He saw mothers cry quietly behind drawn curtains after the police came knocking. He heard the rumors, who got shot, who got set up, who disappeared. Violence wasn't hidden in the Bronx, it was woven into daily life. The adults said it was temporary, that the neighborhood would change, that things would get better. But to young Pete, the only thing changing was who was on top and who got taken out. The cycle was endless, and if he was going to survive it, he couldn't stay on the sidelines. At first, it started small. A few errands for older boys, carrying a bag here, delivering a message there. It wasn't about money yet, it was about belonging. The streets were tribal, and belonging meant safety. If people knew you, if they respected you, you were less likely to become another name on the block's mural wall. Pete had a gift for reading people. He could tell who was nervous, who was lying, who was desperate. He didn't brag or act tough, he just listened, remembered, and stayed calm. That made him valuable. And in the Bronx, value was the only currency that mattered more than cash. The temptations grew with each favor. Soon, Pete was trusted with more serious tasks, holding something for someone, keeping lookout, delivering small packages that he knew weren't candy. He didn't ask questions, he just delivered results. He began to earn money, not much, but enough to buy new sneakers, maybe a jacket that stood out. It was a strange kind of pride. He wasn't proud of what he was doing, but proud that he could do it well. Pride and guilt often shared the same heartbeat in the Bronx. You learn to ignore one to feel the other. At home, his mother worried. She could see the changes, the longer nights, the quiet confidence, the tired eyes in the morning. But what could she say? In a neighborhood where jobs were scarce and hope was a rumor, the streets offered the only consistent paycheck. Pete would promise her he was fine, that he was just hanging with friends, that he wasn't into that life. Deep down, though, he knew he was already in too deep to walk away. Every favor he did, every connection he made, tightened the invisible threads pulling him closer to a world he couldn't unsee. Still, Pete kept his cool. While others bragged about their small victories, he observed. He learned the patterns of police patrols, the routines of rival corners, the way drugs moved through the neighborhood like invisible veins. He wasn't the loudest, but he was always watching, always calculating. The streets rewarded that kind of intelligence. The older hustlers started noticing. They'd call him over, ask for his thoughts, include him in conversations that boys his age had no business hearing. Slowly, his name began to circulate, always spoken with a mix of curiosity and respect. That kid Pete, he's sharp. Don't sleep on him. But sharpness came with danger. The more he knew, the more he saw how fragile power really was. One mistake, a bad deal, a wrong word, a moment of weakness, could mean death. He saw it happen. Friends taken out not by rivals, but by the same people they trusted. Loyalty was currency, but betrayal was inflation, it devalued everything overnight. Pete understood early that the streets didn't love anyone, they only rented out affection for as long as you were useful. And so he began to think not like a follower, but like a survivor. The mid-80s brought the crack era, and with it, a new kind of chaos. Money flooded the Bronx faster than anyone could count it, and so did the violence. Corners turned into battlefields, alliances shifted weekly, and fear became the city's soundtrack. Pete stood at the edge of this storm, watching as kids he grew up with turned into soldiers for older, unseen bosses. It was no longer about quick cash, it was about control. Who ran what, who answered to who was willing to do what others wouldn't. The hierarchy of the streets was brutal, but clear. And Pete, ever the observer, was beginning to see the blueprint. There's a moment in every young hustler's life when he must choose, keep running errands or start writing his own rules. For Pete, that moment came quietly, not through violence, but through understanding. He realized that every operation in the neighborhood relied on communication, respect, and fear. He began building relationships carefully, talking less, listening more, remembering everything. He didn't want to be just another name in someone else's story. He wanted to be the one telling it. The transformation was subtle but unstoppable. The boy who once dreamed of basketball courts now studied street maps. The hands that used to dribble a ball now counted bills. The innocence that once softened his gaze had been replaced by something colder, sharper. And yet, he still carried that eerie calm, that silent confidence that made people trust him even when they shouldn't. The streets had tested him, and he'd passed every exam. By his late teens, Peter Rollack wasn't just surviving the Bronx, he was beginning to understand how to control it. The streets had given him everything they had to offer: pain, pride, purpose, and power. The question that lingered wasn't whether he would rise, but how far he would go, and what it would cost him when he got there. The Bronx had turned him from a boy with dreams into a man with plans. And as the night settled once more over Soundview, Pete's eyes were already set beyond the block, beyond the projects, on something larger, something that would soon draw him into a world even the streets whispered about with caution. The first time Peter Rollack felt true confinement wasn't on the streets, it was behind the thick steel doors of Rikers Island. The air there was heavy, not just with humidity but with tension, with the weight of thousands of young men who had already decided they wouldn't be broken. Pete was barely an adult when he was brought in, charged with weapons possession. To the guards, he was just another number, another restless kid from the Bronx. But Pete's eyes told a different story, steady, focused, watching everything. Rikers was chaos, a place where fear ruled, but Pete didn't flinch. He understood something that others didn't yet: power didn't only belong to those with weapons, it belonged to those who could stay calm when everyone else lost control. The corridors of Rikers were loud, echoing with shouts, slamming gates, and the shuffle of chains. Violence erupted over small things: a tray, a glance, a word said too loudly. The guards pretended to control it, but the inmates knew the truth: real order came from those who earned it in blood and loyalty. Every cell block had its hierarchy, and it didn't take long for Pete to see where he fit. He wasn't the biggest or the most violent, but he carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't talk much, but when he did, others listened. In a place where talk could get you killed, his silence became strength. Rikers was a breeding ground for gangs. The Bloods were beginning to spread in New York, splintering into local sets, each with its own rules and leaders. Inside, affiliations meant survival. If you were alone, you were a target. If you had a flag, you had protection, but also responsibility. Pete spent the first week studying the prison's unspoken system: who controlled the phones, who ran contraband, who had connections to guards. He noticed how power moved like a current, quietly but decisively. And like any current, if you learned to ride it instead of fight it, you could travel far. One night, in the dim light of the cell block, a fight broke out, fast, brutal, and over before most inmates could react. Pete stayed still, watching, analyzing. The winner wasn't the stronger one, he was the one who moved first, who knew where to strike. That lesson stayed with Pete. The next day, word spread, that Bronx kid ain't soft. He hadn't even thrown a punch, but his composure under pressure had made an impression. Respect in prison doesn't always come from violence, it comes from presence, from the way you carry yourself when the walls feel like they're closing in. Pete had that presence. As weeks turned into months, he began to form bonds with certain inmates, men with ambition, intelligence, and a shared disdain for weakness. Among them were members of the Bloods, and more specifically, a subset that would one day carry Pete's own mark. The conversation started small: talk about the streets, about the Bronx, about how things could be run better, smarter. Pete didn't brag about his past, but the way he spoke made others believe he had a plan. They saw something in him: leadership. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but his words carried weight. The prison yard was where reputations were built and tested. Under the harsh afternoon sun, Pete walked the yard with measured steps, eyes scanning the crowd. Every day, alliances were formed and broken in that rectangle of dirt and concrete. He noticed who deferred to whom, who was rising, who was slipping. It wasn't just survival, it was sociology. Pete wasn't just living through Rikers, he was studying it. He began to think about what could exist beyond these walls. What if there was a network, one that didn't crumble when its members were locked up, one that thrived under pressure instead of collapsing? The idea lingered quietly at the back of his mind. But Rikers wasn't all theory, it was constant testing. One afternoon, a confrontation found him. A bigger inmate, already serving years, decided to test the new Bronx kid's resolve. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and in that instant, Pete moved. Fast. Efficient. He didn't brawl, he struck once, decisively, enough to make his point. Guards broke it up, inmates whispered. From that moment, the whispers changed. He wasn't just that quiet Bronx kid anymore. He was Pistol Pete. The nickname stuck, born not from the street but from the way he handled himself, sharp, quick, precise. That name would become legend, but at the time, it was just another piece of armor. Pete learned quickly that in prison, identity was protection. If people believed you were dangerous, they thought twice before testing you. Yet, despite his growing reputation, Pete wasn't reckless. He didn't start unnecessary conflicts, he ended them. He began mediating disputes, speaking to both sides, finding solutions that benefited him in the long run. It was politics, played inside a cage. Every favor he did, every word he chose carefully, every connection he nurtured, these became bricks in the foundation of something larger than himself. By now, his circle had expanded. The men around him weren't just gang members, they were strategists, thinkers, survivors. Together, they discussed structure. Pete had seen the chaos on the streets, the endless cycle of young men dying over corners and ego. What if, instead, there was organization? What if loyalty was structured, business-minded, and disciplined? Out of those late-night conversations, between whispers and coded notes, an idea was born. A brotherhood that represented the three things every hustler valued: sex, money, and murder. SMM. It was more than a name, it was a philosophy. A declaration that the game could be ruled with both mind and muscle. From that moment, Pete wasn't just surviving Rikers, he was building something. He began sending messages out through visitors, through letters, through coded conversations. The Bronx needed leadership, and even behind bars, Pete was ready to provide it. The irony wasn't lost on him, he was confined, yet freer than most men he knew. Because for the first time, he had purpose. He had vision. Rikers, meant to break him, had instead sharpened him into something dangerous and deliberate. Days turned to weeks, and weeks into months. His name began to travel beyond the prison walls. Young men on the outside started hearing about Pistol Pete, the Bronx Warlord who called shots from a cell. They respected him not because of where he was, but because of what he represented: discipline, control, and power. In the projects, his legend was growing. The message was clear: even behind bars, he was untouchable. Inside, Pete remained methodical. He read books on law and strategy, listened to older inmates' stories, learned from their mistakes. Every story of betrayal, every downfall of a once great hustler became another lesson. He wasn't planning to be another statistic. He was planning to outlast everyone. The nights were long on Rikers. The hum of fluorescent lights mixed with distant shouts and the occasional clank of a closing gate. Pete would lie awake on his cot, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Soundview, about the people waiting outside, about the empire he was beginning to build without even touching the streets. The thought made him smile, a slow, quiet smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't know it yet, but those sleepless nights would mark the beginning of a reign unlike any the Bronx had seen before. And so, as another morning dawned over Rikers Island, with seagulls circling the towers and guards unlocking doors, a new kind of power was being born, not from freedom, but from captivity. Pistol Pete had entered the system as another number. He would leave it as a name whispered with both respect and fear. The streets would soon feel his reach, and the Bronx would never be the same. The Bronx never really slept, but there were hours in the early morning when the city seemed to hold its breath. Streetlights flickered against windows still fogged from the night before, and the hum of cars was replaced by the soft rustle of wind through the towers of the Soundview houses. In those quiet hours, something invisible moved, a current of influence that flowed from behind the gray walls of a distant prison. From a small, dim cell, Pistol Pete Rollack was learning how to command an empire without ever seeing its streets. His body was confined, but his name, his words, and his orders traveled freely, carried through whispers, letters, and loyalty. Inside Rikers, Pete had turned confinement into strategy. He knew that control came not from shouting orders but from making people want to follow. The men who'd served time with him had seen it firsthand, his composure, his intelligence, the way he could turn chaos into structure. When some of them were released, they carried his words with them like scripture. They returned to the Bronx with quiet instructions, coded ideas, and the beginnings of something powerful: Sex Money Murder, the organization that would soon stamp its initials across the borough's soul. The foundation was built not on money but on respect. Pete understood the psychology of power better than most. He knew that loyalty could not be bought, it had to be earned. He made sure every man who claimed his name on the outside understood one rule: discipline before dominance. It wasn't about random violence or reckless ambition, it was about precision. Every corner taken had to serve a purpose. Every move had to mean something. The streets of the Bronx were already overflowing with hustlers, but few had strategy. Pete was about to change that. On the outside, Soundview was transforming. The crack epidemic had turned neighborhoods into open-air markets. Dealers worked under flickering streetlights, stashing product in trash cans, under stairwells, even in baby strollers. The cops came and went, but nothing slowed the flow. Amid the chaos, the young men of Sex Money Murder began to rise. They dressed sharp, moved in groups, and spoke with a confidence that set them apart. People started to notice. "Those are Pete's people," they'd whisper, not always knowing what it meant, but feeling the weight of the name. Pete's communication from prison was subtle but constant. He used letters written in carefully coded language. What looked like casual talk about family or sports were, in truth, directions for strategy. He built a chain of trust, using a few key intermediaries to pass on his words. Each message contained more than instructions, it carried intent. His people felt chosen, part of something greater than themselves. Even though their leader sat behind bars, they believed he was watching over them. That belief alone was enough to keep them aligned, focused, and dangerous. There were stories, some true, some exaggerated, of Pete ordering discipline from inside. If someone broke code, if someone threatened the structure, word would come down from prison like lightning. A warning. A consequence. A disappearance. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it reinforced the myth. Pistol Pete didn't need to be there to be obeyed. His voice carried further than most men's presence ever could. The idea of him became more powerful than the man himself. As SMM grew, so did its profits. The streets became organized under zones, certain blocks handled distribution, others handled enforcement. Pete's lieutenants made sure the money flowed smoothly and the product stayed clean. In the Bronx underworld, efficiency meant survival, and under Pete's distant rule, efficiency was law. Those who followed him described a sense of order that hadn't existed before. There were codes about conduct, about loyalty, even about family. He didn't want his people acting recklessly, he wanted them to act with purpose. Still, the streets were unpredictable. Rivals noticed the red wave rising through Soundview. Other crews wanted in, others wanted war. Tension simmered. But Pete, ever the strategist, kept his cool. Through messages smuggled in and out of prison, he gave instructions that were surgical, not emotional. If conflict couldn't be avoided, it had to be decisive. He believed that if you had to draw blood, make it mean something, one example to prevent 10 more problems. The message was clear: chaos was bad for business, and business was the heart of everything. The press and police began to take notice. Reports described a new level of organization within Bronx gangs, communications that seemed to come from nowhere, a structure that defied the usual patterns. Detectives started connecting the dots, tracing the letters, listening to intercepted phone calls. But Pete stayed one step ahead. His system was built on loyalty, not technology. The feds could tap phones, but they couldn't tap hearts. His men weren't just employees, they were believers. At night, in his solitary cell, Pete would often sit quietly on the edge of his cot, the sound of distant doors clanging through the corridor. He didn't speak much to others, but inside his mind, the streets unfolded in perfect detail. He could picture the Soundview projects, the rhythm of footsteps, the corners lit by street lamps, the young soldiers in red bandanas standing watch. He imagined the hum of cars, the laughter before deals, the pulse of life that still moved to his beat. He was there without being there, a ghost in control of the living. Even the prison guards began to notice the strange aura around him. He wasn't like the others. He didn't cause trouble, didn't argue, didn't lash out. He moved with purpose, as though every minute behind bars was an investment, not a punishment. The other inmates respected that. Some feared it. They'd whisper stories about the things he could make happen with just one letter, one nod. He was already becoming myth, a man whose reach extended through concrete and barbed wire. But with growth came risk. The larger the network became, the more attention it drew. Rival crews wanted to test the empire that called itself Sex Money Murder. The police started piecing together connections. Informants whispered Pete's name in hushed tones. Each new success added another layer of scrutiny, another shadow in which betrayal could hide. And yet, Pete didn't flinch. He knew this was part of the game. Power invited danger. The key was to never let the danger see you blink. On the outside, Soundview at night was a different world now. The corners once ruled by scattered hustlers were under unified control. The air smelled of gasoline and ambition. The men who worked those blocks weren't random dealers anymore, they were soldiers in a structured order, part of something that felt bigger than the streets. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, in a cell lit by a single bulb, the architect of it all sat with folded hands, calm, still, listening to the echo of his own creation through the bars. Pete had done what few ever could, he'd turned imprisonment into empowerment. From behind walls meant to contain him, he had stretched invisible hands across the Bronx, shaping it, guiding it, owning it. And though he couldn't see the city skyline from his window, he didn't need to. His empire was alive, moving, breathing, growing. The Bronx whispered his name not in fear alone, but in recognition of something greater, a man who'd mastered control, not by holding the streets, but by holding their loyalty. The warlord was still caged, but his will was free. And outside those walls, his creation, his legacy, was just beginning to take shape. What no one knew then was how far his influence would reach, how deeply it would cut into the fabric of New York streets, or how the empire he built from silence would one day attract the kind of attention that could destroy even the most careful king. But for now, Pete ruled from the shadows, his power as quiet and steady as the heartbeat of the Bronx itself. The rise of sex money murder in the Bronx was no longer a secret whispered in stairwells, it was a presence that could be felt in the rhythm of the streets, in the way people moved, talked, and even looked over their shoulders. Soundview had transformed into a living network of loyalty, business, and reputation, and at the center of it all was a man still locked away, orchestrating everything from behind bars. But no empire grows in silence for long. As the influence of Pistol Pete spread beyond the projects, so did the attention, from rivals, from law enforcement, and from the city itself. The mid-1990s in the Bronx were tense years. The crack epidemic still carved deep wounds into communities, and gangs had become both protectors and predators. Sex money murder's red flags began to dominate entire corners, graffiti on walls, red bandanas around wrists and necks, symbols etched onto benches and staircases. For outsiders, it was a warning. For insiders, it was identity. To belong to S.M.M. meant you weren't just another hustler, you were part of a structured order that moved with discipline and purpose. From his cell, Pete had become a conductor of chaos turned order. His letters were sermons, his word the law. Those chosen to lead on the outside, his lieutenants, followed a strict code of communication. They didn't just relay orders, they embodied Pete's philosophy. The Bronx was not to be ruled with wildness but with balance, fear and respect had to coexist. His men began enforcing structure in their operations, assigned territories, specific times for movement, and clear rules about who could sell, who could collect, and who could speak his name. But the more organized they became, the more visible they grew. The streets don't stay quiet for long when money starts to flow. The movement of product and profit drew envy from other crews, groups like the Bloods and the Latin Kings, who were not accustomed to seeing outsiders carve territory so confidently. The Bronx became a chessboard, and every block was a square that someone wanted to control. Pete's response to this shifting landscape was as calm as it was calculated. He didn't allow panic. Instead, he tightened the structure. He had always believed that strength didn't come from aggression, it came from clarity. He reminded his people that discipline was power. Anyone can pull a trigger, he was said to have written in one of his letters. Not everyone can move an army. In the neighborhoods of Soundview, Castle Hill, and Bronx River, young men began to speak Pete's name like a mantra. Pistol Pete runs this, they'd say, half in fear, half in awe. He had become both legend and ghost. Some of the younger members had never seen him in person, yet they lived by his word. It was as though the idea of Pete had transcended the man himself, his image transformed into a myth of control, loyalty, and unstoppable rise. But myths have a way of inviting challenge. Rivals who didn't fear him tested boundaries. A few minor crews tried encroaching on S.M.M. territory, hoping Pete's influence was weaker than it seemed. They quickly learned otherwise. Within days, retaliation struck with surgical precision. Streets went silent again. The message was clear, even from prison, Pete could touch you. That truth traveled faster than fear itself, reinforcing the aura of invincibility that surrounded his name. Meanwhile, law enforcement began connecting threads that had previously seemed separate. Detectives noticed the unusual organization within S.M.M., its hierarchy, its codes, its communications. This wasn't random street activity, this was strategy. The more they studied it, the more they realized how unusual Pete's control was. Other gang leaders lost power once they were locked up. Pete's only seemed to grow. Undercover officers began circulating through Soundview, posing as dealers and buyers, trying to map the structure. But Pete's system of loyalty made infiltration almost impossible. Every new face was questioned, tested, and verified. Betrayal was not just punished, it was erased. Those who violated trust didn't get warnings, they disappeared. The Bronx police precincts were full of unspoken truths, and one of them was this: no one crossed sex, money, murder and lived to talk about it. At night, Soundview had its own soundtrack. The low bass of cars passing through, laughter spilling from open windows, the echo of sneakers against pavement. The red glow of streetlights shimmered off graffiti tags that read, S.M.M., in thick, dripping paint. For many residents, it was an uneasy coexistence. On one hand, the crew brought a sense of order, there was less random violence, fewer unregulated hustlers causing chaos. On the other hand, that order was enforced by fear. You didn't speak to the police. You didn't question authority. You didn't say Pete's name unless you meant it. Back inside his cell, Pete had developed a quiet ritual. After the noise of the day subsided, he would sit with his head down, eyes closed, picturing his streets. The prison's walls couldn't contain his imagination. He could visualize every block, every loyal man, every stack of money. He wasn't daydreaming, he was strategizing. His empire wasn't about greed, it was about control. Control of movement, control of loyalty, control of destiny. The Bronx was his chessboard, and he moved pieces even from exile. But in that control, cracks began to form. Some lieutenants, emboldened by power, started acting on their own. They made decisions without authorization, sometimes out of greed, sometimes out of pride. Pete's reaction was swift and cold. Those who stepped out of line were reminded of the rules, brutally. His system depended on obedience, and he would protect that order at all costs. Yet, each punishment, each act of correction, drew more attention from the outside world. The myth was solidifying, but so was the target on his back. As the decade progressed, the streets around Soundview began to shift again. The old crack markets were changing, the violence was evolving, and the police were growing more organized. Federal agencies started to take notice, especially the FBI, which had seen similar patterns in organized crime families. They began to realize that what Pistol Pete had built wasn't just a street gang, it was an enterprise. And like all empires, it had begun to shine too brightly to stay hidden. The power that once gave Pete control was now illuminating him in the crosshairs of a larger, more dangerous enemy, one that couldn't be intimidated by loyalty or fear. Still, inside that cell, Pete didn't panic. He was calm, even as the first hints of a storm gathered around him. His faith in his design was unshakable. He had built Sex Money Murder not as a gang, but as a system, a living thing that could operate even without him. What he didn't yet realize was that the system, once it reached a certain size, would start to have a will of its own. The Bronx was whispering his name louder than ever. From schoolyards to nightclubs, from hallways to jails, the legend of Pistol Pete was everywhere. But legends have gravity, they attract not only believers but enemies. And in the coming years, the weight of his legend would pull everything, his crew, his family, and even himself, toward a reckoning he could no longer control. In those long, echoing nights behind bars, as the city pulsed beyond his reach, Pete was about to learn that even the strongest empire begins to tremble when its shadow grows larger than its foundation. The Bronx had become a living reflection of one man's will. From his small prison cell, Pistol Pete Rollack's voice echoed across entire neighborhoods, commanding loyalty, instilling fear, and shaping destinies. The streets whispered his name like scripture. He had achieved what few ever could, an empire of loyalty, precision, and control from behind the iron gates meant to silence him. But every empire, no matter how strong, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. For Pete, those seeds began to grow the moment his name became too powerful, too loud, too unavoidable. By the late 1990s, Sex Money Murder wasn't just a Bronx name, it was a movement. The red and black flags, the coded graffiti, the hand signs, all of it had spread beyond Soundview into Castle Hill, the South Bronx, and even neighboring cities like Mount Vernon and Paterson, New Jersey. Each new territory added power, but also risk. The hierarchy Pete had built was struggling to maintain cohesion. Some lieutenants wanted expansion at any cost, others warned that too much visibility would attract unwanted eyes. For a man like Pete, who valued structure over chaos, the whispers of dissent were the first cracks in the armor. The streets had started to shift. The city was changing, new players, new drugs, new methods. Where once the crack epidemic had ruled, heroin and powder cocaine were taking over. Gangs were evolving, too. The Bloods were growing stronger, uniting smaller crews under one flag. The Latin Kings still dominated large parts of the city. Everyone wanted a piece of what Pete had built. And though Pete's soldiers were disciplined, their control depended on fear, and fear, once diluted, could vanish fast. In Soundview, Pete's lieutenants tried to keep the structure intact. They collected money, settled disputes, and made sure the street stayed under SMM rule. But not everyone followed the code as strictly as before. Some were young, reckless, eager to prove themselves. They moved without permission, started unnecessary fights, flaunted money in ways Pete never approved of. The new generation had grown up hearing Pete's name as legend, they respected him, but they didn't truly understand him. They knew his power, but not his patience. Pete noticed this shift even from behind bars. The letters he received carried tension, rumors of betrayal, small power struggles, people forgetting the rules. The calm order he had spent years constructing was beginning to tremble under its own weight. Pete's tone in his communications changed. His letters became sharper, colder, more direct. He reminded his lieutenants that loyalty was not optional, it was survival. The moment you forget who you serve, he reportedly wrote in one note, you stop existing. But the outside world had already started to notice the cracks too. Detectives working in the Bronx were piecing together how Pete's network operated. They'd map names, connections, and movements on cork boards covered in red string. They started seeing patterns, coordinated actions, synchronized retaliation, clean organization. This wasn't random street violence. It was something far more methodical. The NYPD began cooperating with the federal government, building a case not just against individuals, but against the structure itself. Meanwhile, within the Bronx, Pete's myth continued to grow in strange and uncontrollable ways. He was still in prison, yet stories spread that he had supernatural control over his crew, that his letters were written in invisible ink, that he could order a man's death with a phone call, that he never slept. The truth was simpler, but just as powerful. Pete was a man who understood psychology. He let the myth grow because it served his purpose. The more people believed he was untouchable, the less they dared to test him. And yet, every myth has a breaking point. A few of Pete's own began to forget the code. They started hustling for themselves, hiding profits, defying small orders. Pete responded swiftly. Those who betrayed were punished in ways that made examples of them. Word spread through Soundview like wildfire. Pete might be locked up, but his power could still reach you. These disciplinary actions temporarily restored fear, but they also drew unwanted attention from law enforcement. Every lesson became another piece of evidence, another reason for investigators to dig deeper. The late nights in Soundview were filled with tension now. The calm control that once defined SMM had turned into an undercurrent of paranoia. Who was loyal? Who was being watched? Who was talking too much? The red flags on the corners still waved proudly, but beneath them, anxiety had taken root. It wasn't just the police that worried them, it was the possibility that Pete's empire, so carefully constructed, might begin to devour itself from within. Inside his cell, Pete felt the shift too. He was receiving fewer updates that reassured him, and more that hinted at chaos. He had spent years teaching discipline, but the younger soldiers were too hungry for fast money, too addicted to power. The empire he'd built was beginning to act on instinct rather than order. Pete's words still carried weight, but distance was beginning to dull the edge. He knew what was coming. When loyalty weakens, betrayal follows. The police, now working with federal agents, had begun targeting SMM leaders systematically. Surveillance increased. Phones were tapped, letters intercepted. Informants were planted, some through pressure, some through promises. Every move was being recorded, every meeting watched. Still, Pete's men believed their code could protect them. But the government wasn't just coming for them as individuals, it was preparing to dismantle the system Pete had created, piece by piece. By the time Pete heard whispers of federal task forces moving in the Bronx, it was too late. They weren't coming for small arrests. They were building a case designed to remove the head of the empire, to prove that even from behind bars, Pete had orchestrated violence and trafficking. They wanted to end the myth once and for all. The city's newspapers began running stories about a gang leader who ruled the Bronx from prison. They described him as a shadow general, a warlord controlling soldiers through coded messages and loyal disciples. Every headline, every whisper, every rumor added to the tension. Pete's name was now larger than his crew, larger than Soundview itself. And when a name grows that large, it becomes both power and target. In the Bronx, the younger members of SMM began to realize the empire was under watch. Some doubled down on loyalty, others vanished quietly. But one truth hung in the air like smoke: Pete's control, as unbreakable as it once seemed, was now being tested by forces even he couldn't manipulate: the law, betrayal, and time. As Pete sat in his cell, staring at the cracked paint on the wall, he could almost feel the shifting energy of his empire. He had built something immortal, something that would outlive him, or so he believed. But now the sound of keys in the corridor and the distant echo of guards' boots felt heavier, closer. The empire that once moved like a ghost across the Bronx was beginning to take form, and in that visibility lay its greatest vulnerability. The rise had been silent, calculated, brilliant. But every rise casts a shadow. And as Pete's name spread across headlines and wiretaps, that shadow was beginning to darken into something inevitable, the beginning of the end. The storm had been building quietly for months, maybe years. On the surface, the Bronx still pulsed with the same familiar rhythm, the flash of headlights on cracked pavement, the hum of late-night music echoing from project windows, the steady murmur of deals being made beneath the glow of streetlights. But underneath, something darker was shifting. Law enforcement had begun to move in silence, collecting information, watching, listening. And at the center of their growing investigation was one name that seemed to appear everywhere, Peter Rollack, known to the streets as Pistol Pete. To the agents piecing together the puzzle, Pete wasn't just another gang leader, he was an anomaly. How could a man locked away for years still control such an extensive network? How could messages travel from a cell in Rikers Island to corners in Soundview and beyond? It was unlike anything they had seen before. To them, this wasn't just a gang, it was an organization, built with the discipline and reach of a criminal enterprise. And so, quietly, methodically, the authorities began constructing a case to prove it. The first step was intelligence. Federal agents started working hand in hand with the NYPD's Gang Task Force, exchanging notes, maps, and wiretap recordings. They followed the money, traced the letters, and cross-checked names. Each clue added another layer to the web. The pieces began to align, a structure of lieutenants, soldiers, and enforcers, all connected to one man whose orders came from behind walls. It wasn't long before the feds began calling it the Soundview Network. In Soundview itself, the tension was palpable. Pete's lieutenants noticed the sudden presence of unmarked cars idling too long near corners, new faces appearing in familiar places, people asking too many questions. The neighborhood had always lived under a watchful eye, but this was different. The air carried a new kind of unease, the feeling of being hunted. Pete, still in prison, heard about the surveillance through coded messages. His instinct told him the feds were getting close. He'd survived too long to ignore the signs. The once calm strategist became even more meticulous. Every word he sent out was reviewed, rewritten, wrapped in layers of meaning. He began instructing his lieutenants to use couriers who didn't know each other, to communicate through family members, and to destroy letters immediately after reading. No paper, no proof, he was said to have warned. But the government's reach was deepening. They had started flipping informants, people once loyal to the streets but now trapped between prison sentences and betrayal. Some had families, some had debts, and all had secrets. The agents knew how to exploit that. Quietly, names began to surface, and for the first time, cracks appeared in the armor of Pete's network. Soundview, once unified by discipline, was now vibrating with paranoia. Every silence felt suspicious. Every conversation seemed dangerous. Some of Pete's men began to move differently, staying indoors, using payphones only at certain hours, changing cars frequently. Others grew careless, assuming the feds couldn't touch what they couldn't see. It was that arrogance, that tiny sliver of overconfidence, that the agents needed. Inside the federal offices in Manhattan, the case files were growing taller. Photos of Soundview corners, surveillance shots of meetings, transcripts of recorded calls, all connected by red string to one name, Pistol Pete. The goal was no longer just to catch his soldiers, it was to prove that Pete himself had ordered murders, controlled drug routes, and managed a criminal organization from behind bars. That was the foundation of a RICO case, a federal charge designed for organized crime. In the Bronx, word started spreading that the feds were preparing something big. Pete's people tried to stay calm, but the whispers spread faster than the truth. Every time someone was arrested, rumors flew about who might be talking. "Don't trust nobody" became the new mantra. Even loyal soldiers began looking over their shoulders. It was no longer about power, it was about survival. Pete, though confined, refused to show fear. To those who visited him, he remained calm, almost detached. He believed in his structure, believed that his code of silence would protect him. "They can't stop what they can't understand," he once said. And for years, that had been true. The government didn't understand how deeply loyalty ran in the Bronx, how much pride was tied to the S.M.M. name. But this time, the enemy wasn't the streets, it was the system. And the system had patience. As the months passed, agents began connecting Pete to specific acts of violence. They traced coded letters to incidents of retaliation. They matched intercepted calls with known murders. Piece by piece, they began constructing a portrait of a man who had turned incarceration into command. They interviewed former members, some too scared to speak, others too bitter to stay silent. Slowly, the story began to take shape: Pistol Pete, the warlord of Soundview, who ruled the Bronx from behind bars. The Bronx itself seemed to sense the shift. Nights grew quieter, corners emptier. The once booming sound of car stereos and laughter faded into cautious whispers. Mothers warned their sons to stay inside, to avoid the red bandanas, to avoid being seen with the wrong people. Even those outside the life could feel the change. Something big was coming. In prison, Pete had begun to isolate himself more. He knew eyes were on him, guards, informants, maybe even men pretending to be allies. He stopped trusting new faces entirely. He only communicated with a handful of people he considered family, and even then, only through messages stripped of emotion, pure instruction. But no matter how careful he became, the feds were already inside the walls of his empire. By late 1999, the groundwork was complete. The FBI, DEA, and NYPD had combined forces, forming a task group dedicated solely to dismantling sex money murder. The operation had a name: Operation Soundview. And its objective was simple: bring down the man who had built an invisible kingdom from behind bars. Agents began coordinating early morning raids, arresting lieutenants, collecting evidence, and interrogating anyone who might lead them to Pete's command structure. Each arrest sent ripples of panic through the streets. Some held strong. Others broke quickly. The walls were closing in, and everyone could feel it. Through it all, Pete remained composed. He had always believed that every man must face his destiny with calm. He had built something that had outlasted bullets, betrayal, and time itself. But even he knew that no empire lasts forever. In the quiet of his cell, Pete would sometimes close his eyes and listen, to the distant echo of guards, to the hum of fluorescent lights, to the silence that only men who command entire worlds can truly understand. The Bronx was still moving, still breathing, still whispering his name. But now those whispers were changing. They weren't just filled with awe, they carried fear, uncertainty, and the faintest sound of collapse. The law had found its rhythm, and it was coming for him with the same quiet precision he had once used to build his empire. The warlord who ruled from behind bars was about to face an enemy that played a longer game, one that didn't need guns or fear, just patience, paperwork, and time. The empire had been built in silence, and now, in silence, it would begin to crumble. The dawn that broke over the Bronx in early 2000 felt different. It wasn't the usual hum of city life or the echo of trains cutting across bridges. It was heavier, quieter, charged with tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The people in Soundview knew something was coming. There were more unmarked cars on the corners, more questions from unfamiliar faces, more raids that began before sunrise and ended with doors ripped off hinges. The rhythm of the streets had changed, and everyone felt it. Sex Money Murder, the empire built by Pistol Pete Rollack, was about to face the reckoning it had long outrun. The operation had been months in the making. The FBI and NYPD had mapped out every layer of Pete's network. They had traced the flow of drugs, the money laundering, the retaliatory hits, all the pieces of an organization that, astonishingly, still answered to a man serving time. For years, they had been gathering fragments of proof, but now, they had enough to move. In early spring, they began executing coordinated arrests under the umbrella of Operation Soundview, a sweeping effort to dismantle the gang from the top down. The first wave hit the streets like thunder. Helicopters hovered above the projects while federal agents in black vests poured into stairwells and hallways. Doors splintered, voices shouted commands, and within minutes, entire blocks were locked down. Men who once stood proudly under the red banner of S.M.M. were dragged out in handcuffs, their faces illuminated by flashing blue lights. Mothers screamed from balconies. Kids watched from behind curtains. To the people of the Bronx, it felt like the ground itself was shifting. Inside the prison where Pete was held, the news reached him fast. He was calm as ever when he heard about the arrests, no visible reaction, no panic. But inside, he knew what this meant. The feds weren't coming for foot soldiers anymore, they were coming for him. For years, he had stayed steps ahead, his coded letters and discipline protecting him from direct ties to the crimes carried out in his name. But the case they were building wasn't about single acts, it was about control, structure, influence. They were painting him as a puppet master, a general running a war from a cell. The key to the government strategy lay in the RICO Act, a powerful legal tool once used against the mafia. It allowed prosecutors to charge leaders for crimes committed by their organization, even if they hadn't physically committed the acts themselves. All they needed to prove was that Pete had ordered, guided, or approved the actions of his soldiers. That single idea, command responsibility, was enough to bring down entire empires. As federal prosecutors dug deeper, they uncovered letters Pete had written to trusted lieutenants, instructions that used coded language about handling business, setting examples, or moving product. Individually, they meant little. But when combined with testimony from informants and patterns in violence, they painted a chilling picture, a man who had turned confinement into a command post. The feds knew they needed more than paper, they needed people. And slowly, painfully, they began to turn Pete's inner circle. Some resisted, swearing loyalty even under the threat of decades in prison. Others, however, began to waver. The weight of federal time, the fear of never seeing their families again, and the lure of a deal were enough to make some talk. The once solid wall of silence that had protected Pete for years began to crack. The Bronx streets felt the tremors. With lieutenants disappearing and soldiers locked up, the flow of business stuttered. Corners went unclaimed, and rival crews began circling, ready to reclaim lost ground. For the first time in years, Soundview wasn't under clear control. The red colors of S.M.M. still appeared, but the power behind them had dimmed. The younger generation, the ones who grew up hearing about Pete's reign, now saw the reality: empires fall, even those that once seemed immortal. Pete's reputation inside prison was still formidable. To many inmates, he was a symbol of what control and intellect could achieve, even behind bars. But to the guards and investigators, he was now a priority target. His cell was searched regularly. Every letter he sent or received was scrutinized. His phone privileges were monitored. It was clear, the system was tightening around him. At night, when the noise of the cell block faded and the flickering lights dimmed, Pete would sit silently on his cot, thinking of the streets. He could imagine Soundview's skyline, the glow of apartment windows, the echo of laughter from stairwells. He wondered how his people were holding up, whether the discipline he'd taught them still held, or whether fear had overtaken loyalty. The hardest truth of leadership is knowing that power cannot survive distance forever. Meanwhile, the media had caught on. Headlines began to appear in major papers: gang leader accused of running Bronx Empire from prison, federal crackdown on sex money murder, the warlord of Soundview. Each headline made Pete's name larger, more mythical, but also more dangerous. The government wanted to make an example of him, a warning that even behind bars, no one was untouchable. Federal prosecutors filed their charges with precision. Murder conspiracies, racketeering, drug trafficking, and leadership in a criminal enterprise, all tied together under the RICO statute. It was one of the most ambitious gang indictments in Bronx history. To the public, it looked like justice. To Pete, it felt like betrayal by the very code that had once protected him. But Pete wasn't naive. He had always known the game's rules: everyone rises, everyone falls. What mattered was how you faced the fall. He didn't beg, didn't deny, didn't panic. He met his fate with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through years of confinement. "They can lock my body," he once said, "but not my name." The Bronx began to change in his absence. Streets once filled with fear were now under surveillance. The sound of helicopters replaced the sound of hustlers. Police patrols became constant. To the community, it was both relief and loss: relief that the violence might slow, loss of a strange kind of order that Pete's rule had once brought. In the halls of justice, as prosecutors finalized their case, the image of Pistol Pete transformed. To the authorities, he was no longer just a gang leader, he was a symbol of a generation of power that thrived in chaos. They wanted to show that even the invisible could be caught. The legend of the Bronx Warlord had grown too big, too uncontained, and now it was time to bring it down. And yet, behind all the noise, behind the headlines and the handcuffs, Pete remained calm. His letters stopped. His communication ceased. For the first time in years, he went silent. It was as though he had accepted that his time as the architect of Soundview's empire was ending. But legends don't die easily. Even as his trial approached, even as the walls closed in, whispers still echoed through the Bronx, stories of his discipline, his control, his unbreakable will. In those whispers, Pete lived on. In the cracked sidewalks of Soundview, in the graffiti still spelling S.M.M. on faded walls, his name still pulsed like a heartbeat. The empire had been wounded, but the myth, the story of the man who ruled from behind bars, was only growing stronger. And as the courts prepared to make their move, as the agents gathered the final pieces, the stage was set for what would become the defining chapter of Pete's life: the confrontation between a man of unshakable control and a system determined to erase his legacy from the streets he once commanded. The courtroom was colder than the prison cells Pete had grown accustomed to. The hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet shuffle of papers, and the murmur of spectators filled the air with a tension so thick it could be felt in the bones. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens ready, cameras waiting for a glimpse of the man whose name had become legend. Pistol Pete Rollack, the Bronx Warlord, the man accused of orchestrating chaos from confinement, was finally standing, though shackled, before the judgment of the state. From the moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't walk like a broken man. There was no desperation, no hint of collapse. Pete moved with the same quiet authority that had defined him for years. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned the room not like a defendant, but like a commander assessing the battlefield. The guards stayed close, knowing his reputation, but there was no need for restraint. Pete was calm, eerily calm, as if he had already accepted the outcome long before this day arrived. The prosecutors opened with precision, weaving a narrative that sounded almost cinematic. They painted him as a puppet master, a man who had transformed prison walls into the nerve center of an empire. Through coded letters, whispered instructions, and absolute loyalty, they claimed, Pete had managed to run sex money murder like a business. Every order, every retaliation, every dollar made on the streets traced back to him. It was, they said, the Bronx's version of organized crime, a street-level mafia with a ruler behind bars. To build their case, they called witnesses, former lieutenants, foot soldiers, and informants who had once called Pete boss. Some took the stand reluctantly, eyes down, voices trembling. Others spoke with defiance, their words dripping with the bitterness of betrayal. Each one added a piece to the puzzle: tales of orders passed in code, of punishments dealt for disobedience, of money funneled back through loyal contacts. But the defense countered with quiet sophistication. Pete's attorney argued that the government story was built on the desperation of men seeking lighter sentences. There were no recordings of Pete ordering murders. No fingerprints on the drugs, no direct evidence linking him to the street-level crimes. The letters prosecutors presented were vague, filled with slang and metaphor. Handling business, the defense argued, could mean anything, it wasn't proof of murder or conspiracy. Still, the prosecution had more than paper, they had emotion. They told the stories of victims, of families destroyed by violence. They showed images of crime scenes, of mothers crying outside housing projects. Each image tugged at the jury's sense of morality. This wasn't just a trial of one man, it was a trial of the system that had let fear and blood rule the Bronx. Pete sat through it all with the composure of a man who'd seen the world at its worst. When witnesses spoke his name with venom, he didn't flinch. When prosecutors described him as a warlord, he didn't respond. Occasionally, he leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something short, and then reclined again, his eyes locked forward. To the jurors, he was a mystery, impossibly controlled, unreadable, almost stoic in the face of everything. What many didn't see was the storm beneath that calm. Pete wasn't a man easily rattled, but this was more than a trial, it was a stripping away of identity. For years, he had lived by the code of loyalty, of silence, of power held through respect and discipline. Now, that same discipline was being used against him. Every rule he'd enforced, every soldier he'd guided, was now evidence of his guilt. He could see it in the way the prosecutors spoke. This wasn't about proof, it was about perception. As the days turned into weeks, the courtroom became its own world. Each day started with the same ritual, the slow shuffle of chains, the quiet chatter of spectators, the sound of the gavel echoing through the walls. And each day, Pete's legend grew. The media fed on the contrast, a man who ruled with iron discipline, yet sat silently while others decided his fate. There were moments of tension that pierced even Pete's calm. When one of his former closest allies, someone he had once trusted completely, took the stand and described in detail how orders had come from behind bars, the air in the courtroom thickened. Pete's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. The betrayal was sharp, but he wouldn't show weakness. To him, loyalty wasn't a choice, it was a principle. And even if others abandoned it, he wouldn't. The jury listened, absorbing every story, every photo, every coded letter read aloud. They were ordinary people, teachers, clerks, retirees, now asked to decide the fate of a man whose life existed in a world they couldn't fully understand. To them, Pete was both terrifying and fascinating. A contradiction. A man who could inspire loyalty so fierce that men would die for him, yet who claimed innocence behind bars. Outside the courthouse, the Bronx watched. Some prayed for his freedom, believing Pete was a product of his environment, a man shaped by survival, not evil. Others prayed for his conviction, tired of living under the shadow of his empire. In the streets, conversations split families, divided friends. Was he a leader who brought order, or a tyrant who brought pain? When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution's final words echoed like a sermon: power without accountability is tyranny. And today, we hold that tyranny to account. The defense countered with calm logic: no evidence ties this man directly to these crimes. What you see here is fear, fear of a name, not proof of guilt. The jury deliberated for days. The wait was excruciating. Inside his cell at night, Pete reflected not on the verdict, but on the journey that had brought him here. From the cracked sidewalks of Soundview to the steel cages of federal prison, every choice, every alliance, every order had built this moment. There was no regret, only understanding. Finally, the verdict came. The courtroom filled once more. Pete stood as the foreman rose to speak. His face was still, unreadable. The words that followed felt like the closing of a chapter that had been writing itself for years. Guilty, on multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and murder. A low murmur swept through the room. Some gasped, some cried, some simply nodded. Pete remained motionless. No visible emotion crossed his face. The guard stepped forward, ready to escort him away, but he turned once toward the crowd, toward the faces watching him, the ones who still believed, the ones who never would again. His eyes were calm, almost peaceful. Because deep down, Pete understood something few ever did: empires can crumble, but names can live forever. The system could sentence his body, but it couldn't erase what he had built, what he had represented. As he was led away, the legend of Pistol Pete Rollack, the Bronx Warlord, didn't end. It transformed. The trial had given the government its victory, but in the hearts of those who whispered his name in the Bronx night, Pete remained untouchable, a figure both feared and revered. The man who once ruled from behind bars now carried his kingdom within him, even as the final doors closed behind him and the world outside moved on. The streets would never forget him. And as the echo of the gavel faded, it was clear, this was not just the fall of a man, but the birth of a myth. The prison that awaited Pistol Pete Rollack after his conviction was not like the one he had known before. This was not a county facility filled with noise and chaos, nor a local jail where power could still be traded in whispers and handshakes. This was a world built to silence men like him, a fortress designed to erase influence, to break command, to extinguish control. Pete was transferred to one of the most secure federal institutions in America, a place where every breath was monitored, every step calculated, and every connection severed. The journey there was silent. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, Pete sat motionless in the transport van, his gaze fixed out the window at the world rushing by. The Bronx skyline faded into the distance, and with it went the streets that had once echoed his name. But his mind didn't dwell on loss. He was thinking, planning, analyzing. Power might be stripped from the body, but it could not easily be taken from the mind. Even now, even in defeat, his mind was a weapon sharpened by years of survival. Upon arrival, the change was immediate. The air felt colder, heavier. The walls were thicker, the lighting dimmer. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the mechanical buzz of locking doors and the distant hum of ventilation. The guards here didn't treat inmates as men, they treated them as potential threats, as shadows that needed constant containment. This was supermax confinement, and Pete knew what it meant: 23 hours in a cell, 1 hour alone in a cage under a sliver of sky, no contact, no conversation, no comfort. The cell itself was small, bare concrete walls, a steel toilet, a narrow bed with a thin mattress. No window with a view of the world. Only a slit of light that shifted slightly with the hours. Yet, even here, Pete found rhythm. He organized his time with military precision. Morning push-ups, afternoon meditation, evening writing. The discipline that had made him powerful on the streets now became his means of survival. Where other men screamed, broke, or lost their sense of time, Pete adapted. He began to write again, not letters to the outside world, but reflections. Pieces of thought scrawled on yellow legal pads. They weren't orders or coded instructions this time. They were memories, philosophies, and questions about loyalty, destiny, and consequence. He had always been a thinker disguised as a soldier, and now, with no empire left to command, he turned inward. Each word he wrote was a way to maintain identity, to remain human in a system designed to erase it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The noise of the world faded. In isolation, the mind plays tricks, time stretches, sound amplifies, and memory becomes both enemy and friend. But Pete embraced the solitude. He studied himself. He replayed every choice he had made, every life he had touched, every moment that had led to his rise and fall. There was no self-pity in his reflection, only understanding. He saw the beauty and brutality of the life he'd lived and how it had carved his name into history, even as it consumed him. Occasionally, a guard would speak his name, breaking the silence. Some of them had heard the stories. They'd look at him not as another inmate, but as the legend they'd read about in reports, the man who once ruled a borough from behind bars. Some were curious, some contemptuous. But Pete never responded with anger or pride. He remained detached, his demeanor calm. Respect, he knew, was not demanded, it was commanded by presence alone. At night, the walls would close in tighter. The hum of the fluorescent lights would feel endless. Pete would lie on his bed, eyes open, tracing invisible lines in the ceiling above him. In those hours, his thoughts often drifted back to Soundview, the laughter of kids playing in the courtyard, the echo of footsteps in stairwells, the coded whistles of lookouts. He could almost smell the damp concrete after summer rain, hear the faint thump of bass from passing cars. The Bronx was still inside him, even as the world outside forgot his face. But even in the deepest silence, Pete's name endured beyond those walls. The letters still came in, carefully censored, of course, but filled with reverence. Some were from old allies, others from young men who had grown up hearing stories of him. They called him a legend, a philosopher, a man who represented power and structure in a world of chaos. To them, Pete wasn't just a gangster, he was a symbol of control, of dominance earned through intellect and will. He would read those letters slowly, thoughtfully, then set them aside. Sometimes, he would write short responses, brief, composed, always measured. Never promises, never advice, only quiet reflections that hinted at wisdom beyond the streets. Over time, his words began circulating among inmates, even in other prisons. They were simple, meditative lines, reminders about discipline, patience, and the cost of power. Ironically, the system that had tried to silence him had, in its own way, amplified his voice. Outside the walls, the world was changing. The Bronx of his youth was fading under gentrification and redevelopment. The old corners were being painted over, the names erased from the walls. But within certain circles, especially among the young, the myth of Pistol Pete still lived. His story became cautionary, yet strangely inspiring, a man who rose from the projects to become a name spoken in both fear and awe, only to end up in a cell so small it could barely hold his shadow. In those moments of deep quiet, Pete would sometimes smile, not with joy, but with recognition. He had become what few men ever did, eternal in reputation. The system could confine his body, but it couldn't touch his legacy. It couldn't erase the lessons written in the concrete of the Bronx or in the minds of those who had followed him. Still, the weight of isolation was heavy. Even a man of iron will cannot escape the pull of memory. There were nights when the silence grew too thick, when the echoes of his past, the laughter, the arguments, the gunfire, played like a film behind his closed eyes. He had lived fast, ruled fiercely, and now existed in stillness. The contrast was sharp, almost poetic. And yet, beneath it all, there was peace. Not acceptance of defeat, but a strange kind of understanding. Pete had lived by codes, some brutal, some noble, and he had paid the price they demanded. Now, in solitude, he found what power could never give him, clarity. He began to see his story not as one of crime and punishment, but as one of evolution. The boy who once chased respect through violence had grown into a man who sought meaning through reflection. He had ruled streets, now he ruled his own mind. In the end, prison couldn't erase Pistol Pete, it transformed him. The warlord of Soundview became a figure of myth and meditation, a paradox the world struggled to define. And as the night stretched endlessly into silence, Pete sat within that stillness like a ghost of both past and legend, knowing that even in the smallest cell, a mind as sharp as his could never truly be confined. The years passed like whispers behind concrete walls, one blending into the next until time itself lost meaning. For most men, that kind of silence would have been unbearable, a slow erosion of the soul. But for Pistol Pete Rollack, the man once feared as the Bronx Warlord, it became something else. Isolation had stripped away the noise of power, the constant hum of command, and what remained was the core of who he truly was, a thinker, a survivor, a man trying to understand the world that made him. In the cold glow of fluorescent light, Pete began to see his life in fragments. He replayed his youth, his rise, his reign, and his fall like a film flickering in reverse. There were no guards in this mental theater, no bars on the screen, only memory. And memory, he realized, was the last territory a man could truly rule. He started each morning the same way, with silence. Not the forced silence of prison, but one of choice. He would sit cross-legged on the thin mattress, close his eyes, and breathe deeply until the buzz of the fluorescent lights faded into the background. Meditation had become his armor. It steadied his mind in a place built to shatter it. He thought about Soundview often, not as it was, but as it could have been. He imagined the children playing in the courtyard without fear, the young men who might have built futures instead of reputations, the mothers who might have slept through the night without the sound of sirens. He saw the potential buried beneath the chaos, and in those moments, he understood something he had never allowed himself to before: power without peace was just another form of captivity. The world outside continued to move, unaware of his internal transformation. The Bronx changed faster than he could picture it. Gentrification swept through the borough like a tide, washing away the traces of the past. Buildings that once echoed with the names of crews and corners now stood as sleek apartments and cafes. Yet even as the landscape shifted, the legend of Pistol Pete lingered. His name still carried weight in whispered conversations, especially among the new generation of hustlers trying to make sense of a world that no longer played by the same rules. Inside, Pete began to attract attention of a different kind. Prisoners who had once feared him now sought his guidance. They came to his cell door not for favors or power, but for counsel. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of experience. "Don't chase control," he would tell them quietly. "It's a mirage. Discipline, that's the real power." His reputation within the prison system shifted. Guards noted his composure, his lack of trouble, his ability to diffuse tension with calm authority. Younger inmates, many of whom had grown up hearing his name, began calling him Old Pete, not as mockery, but as respect. He was no longer the general commanding soldiers, he had become a quiet mentor, a keeper of hard-earned wisdom. Occasionally, he would receive letters from the outside. Some came from people he once knew, men long since released, women from his past, even strangers who admired the myth more than the man. But one kind of letter struck him deeply, those from mothers in the Bronx. They wrote about their sons, some in trouble, some already lost, and asked Pete to write to them, to speak sense into boys who idolized his name. It was an irony not lost on him: the man once blamed for leading youth astray was now being asked to save them. Pete began writing again, this time with purpose. His words were deliberate, meditative, stripped of bravado. He wrote about the price of ego, the illusion of respect, the way power corrupts even the strongest hearts. He didn't preach, he reflected. His tone was soft, almost fatherly, like someone trying to guide without judgment. Those letters spread quietly through the streets, photocopied, shared, quoted in online forums and rap lyrics. They became known as the Soundview Papers. Nobody knew if Pete meant for them to be public, but their impact was undeniable. To some, they were redemption. To others, prophecy. Yet even as he found a new purpose, Pete never forgot who he was or where he came from. At night, when the lights dimmed and the hum of the vents filled the air, he would lay on his back and think of his old crew, the brothers who stood beside him, the ones who fell, the ones who betrayed him. He thought of the code they had lived by, the loyalty that once seemed unbreakable. It pained him, not with anger, but with a kind of melancholy acceptance. Time had proven that loyalty built on fear could never last, only loyalty built on understanding could endure. In those reflections, Pete began to find peace, not the kind granted by forgiveness or freedom, but the kind earned through self-awareness. He had been a product of a brutal world, a survivor shaped by violence and ambition. But within the quiet of his cell, he learned that even the hardest men could evolve. The warlord had become a philosopher. The name, Pistol Pete, now carried a dual meaning: one forged in blood, the other in introspection. Sometimes, when new inmates arrived, young, reckless, loud, Pete would watch them from afar. They reminded him of himself once, full of fire and pride, unaware of how fleeting power really was. He didn't lecture them. He just watched, and occasionally, when they hit their breaking point, they'd find themselves at his door, seeking words they didn't even know they needed. And Pete would offer them something simple, calm. Your mind, he'd say softly, is the last thing they can't touch. Protect it. Control that, and you control everything. It was advice born not from theory, but from survival. Pete had lost his freedom, his empire, and his city, but not his mind. And in that realization, he found a strange kind of freedom that no lock could take away. He began to correspond with prison chaplains, psychologists, and community organizers who were intrigued by his transformation. They saw in him the potential to reach those they couldn't. Pete didn't see himself as a savior, he knew his past too well for that, but he understood the power of voice. A single letter from him, a single phrase of clarity, could ripple through the Bronx like a quiet awakening. Still, despite the calm he projected, he remained haunted by one thought: how different things could have been if he had found this clarity earlier. Not regret, Pete didn't believe in that, but curiosity. What if discipline had been used to build, not dominate? What if his leadership had guided, not ruled? It was a thought he carried like a ghost, never spoken, never resolved. Years in isolation had turned him from a man of action into a man of reflection. And though the world outside had largely forgotten his face, the myth of Pistol Pete Rollack had evolved. No longer just a story of power and blood, it was becoming a parable about transformation, about how even in the darkest places, a man could find light if he was willing to face his own shadow. As the years deepened and the gray crept into his hair, Pete sat one night in his cell and wrote a single line in his notebook before the lights went out: you can't change where you come from. But you can choose where your story ends. He closed the notebook, leaned back, and let the silence embrace him. Outside, beyond the steel and concrete, the Bronx slept under the glow of streetlights, unaware that somewhere in the quiet heart of a federal cell, its most infamous son had finally found peace, not through freedom, but through understanding. Years in isolation had reshaped Pistol Pete Rollack into something entirely different, something deeper than the legend that once haunted the Bronx. By the time he entered his second decade of confinement, his name had become mythic. The outside world spoke of him in tones of both awe and warning. To the streets, he was a symbol of discipline and command; to law enforcement, he was the cautionary tale of power gone unchecked. But behind those reinforced walls, away from the stories and the noise, Pete was simply a man in reflection, alive, still calculating, still learning how to exist in silence. The world outside had shifted dramatically since his trial. The Bronx was no longer the raw, volatile borough he had once ruled from the shadows. Hip-hop had become global, the internet had rewritten fame, and entire generations had grown up hearing his name only through songs, documentaries, and whispered recollections. For them, Pistol Pete wasn't just a person, he was an icon of an era long gone, an archetype of street leadership that no longer fit the modern rhythm of crime or culture. Within prison, Pete's life had settled into ritual. The walls around him were unchanged, but inside those walls, his purpose had evolved. He began studying history, particularly the rise and fall of empires. Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, men who, like him, understood both the seduction and the burden of power. He read voraciously, line after line, tracing patterns between ambition and consequence. The stories of fallen kings didn't depress him, they fascinated him. He saw reflections of his own path in their triumphs and their downfalls. Sometimes, he would jot notes in the margins of those books: power is not control, it's trust. Discipline is the only real loyalty. These thoughts began forming a philosophy that went beyond gang codes or street ethics. Pete was building something larger in his mind, a moral architecture that explained his past and redefined his existence. His cell had transformed into a library of sorts. Books stacked neatly against the wall, notebooks filled with reflections, essays half-finished. Guards who once saw him as a danger now saw him as a curiosity, quiet, self-contained, thoughtful. Some of them even began to speak to him differently, cautiously respectful. They'd ask what he was reading, and Pete would share a quote or an idea, never boastful, always measured. The prison system had tried to erase his influence, but now he was influencing it from within in ways they couldn't quantify. Then came something unexpected. The Bureau of Prisons educational coordinator reached out to him through the warden. They had heard of his calm influence on other inmates, of how violence seemed to slow wherever he was assigned. They asked if he would be willing to contribute to a mentorship program, a pilot designed to help at-risk inmates reintegrate and manage anger. It wasn't official teaching, not exactly, it was conversation, structure, presence. Pete agreed. At first, it was awkward. Men came in defensive, skeptical. They had heard the name Pistol Pete but couldn't reconcile the quiet, thoughtful man before them with the myth. But slowly, his presence worked its magic. He didn't preach. He didn't moralize. He simply spoke from experience. He told them about Soundview, about the illusion of control, about how the same discipline that made him a ruler also built his prison. When you chase power, he would say softly, you're really running from fear. Power's not strength, it's armor. You can't live your whole life armored. Those words landed. Even the hardest men listened. In a place where vulnerability was weakness, Pete made it sound like wisdom. Over months, the program began to show results. The fights decreased. The younger inmates stopped testing boundaries as often. Pete's reputation within the system quietly transformed from notorious to necessary. Outside, his story began resurfacing in new ways. A small documentary crew researching 1990s Bronx gangs stumbled across archived footage of his trial. They began interviewing old associates, community members, and retired detectives. What started as a small segment grew into a full-length feature, Pistol Pete, the warlord who ruled from behind bars. The film would eventually spark both controversy and fascination. Inside his cell, Pete didn't care much for the fame, but he understood its power. The documentary painted him as both villain and visionary, a man who represented the dual nature of leadership, the power to build and the capacity to destroy. When he eventually saw the footage, years later, he didn't flinch. "That's part of me," he said quietly to another inmate who asked his thoughts. "But not all of me." The documentary's release rekindled public curiosity. Journalists began writing about him again, but this time with nuance. They explored how the same traits that made him feared, the discipline, intelligence, and control, could have made him a leader in any field. Sociologists cited him in studies on leadership and urban sociology. Even college professors referenced his story in lectures about structure and influence in marginalized environments. Ironically, the man the system had tried to bury had become a subject of study, a lesson in both power and consequence. But Pete himself refused to see it as glorification. "They're not celebrating me," he wrote in a letter that circulated online, "they're studying a mistake. I just happen to be the face of it." In his solitude, Pete began corresponding with people outside who were working in youth outreach and anti-violence programs. They wanted his insight, not his myth, but his mind. He started contributing short essays, philosophical reflections on choices, loyalty, and purpose. His words weren't polished, but they carried weight, honesty, and rhythm. Soon, they began appearing on websites and social media under the title, Letters from the Cell. These writings became a quiet phenomenon. Each one was short, no more than a few paragraphs, but filled with hard-won truth. The streets don't love you. They just remember you long enough to teach the next kid your mistakes. You can't lead men you don't understand. And you can't understand men you don't listen to. I thought fear made people follow. I learned too late that trust is stronger. The word spread through the Bronx and beyond, resonating with a generation disillusioned by both authority and rebellion. For some, Pete's voice was the only one that made sense, the balance between realism and redemption. But even as his influence grew, Pete remained detached from fame. He saw it as another illusion, another form of control he refused to chase. What mattered to him now wasn't recognition, but impact. He wanted to turn the myth of Pistol Pete into something useful, something that might spare even one young life from walking his same path. Inside his cell, he would sometimes look at the old photographs sent by his family, his mother, his siblings, nieces, and nephews he barely knew. They were growing up in a world far removed from the one he had fought to control. The streets that had once been ruled by fear were now being rebuilt, gentrified, sanitized. He wondered what his name meant to them. A ghost? A warning? A relic? One night, under the dim flicker of the cell light, Pete wrote another note in his notebook, one that summed up the evolution of a lifetime. When I was free, I thought leadership meant being followed. Now I know it means being remembered, for the right reasons. He closed the notebook, set it aside, and leaned against the cold wall, listening to the distant sound of metal doors slamming shut down the corridor. To anyone else, that sound meant captivity. But to Pete, it was rhythm, the same rhythm that had once pulsed through the Bronx streets. He was no longer the warlord. He was no longer the king. But in his quiet transformation, Pete Rollack had become something rarer, a man who turned his legend into lesson, his power into perspective, and his silence into a message that would echo long after the prison lights went out. Time moved differently in solitude. For Pistol Pete Rollack, years no longer felt like a march, they were a drift, slow and weightless, marked not by seasons but by thoughts. His body remained confined to the same narrow space, but his mind had started to wander beyond the walls. The transformation that had begun in letters and quiet reflections now reached a deeper stage, self-reconciliation. For the first time, Pete wasn't thinking about the empire he lost or the soldiers who once obeyed him. He was thinking about the man he could have been, the lives intertwined with his rise, and the ghosts of Soundview that still lived within him. Nights were the hardest. In the stillness after lights out, the memories came like film reels, uninvited, vivid, precise. He saw faces, friends who'd died young, rivals who'd fallen harder, mothers who'd wept in hallways. He remembered the feel of the Bronx wind against his skin, the cold metal of a pistol in his palm, the weight of command. There were moments he felt proud of his control, his strength. But those were fleeting, quickly swallowed by guilt and quiet sorrow. The cost of what he built was written in blood, and no amount of reflection could erase it. Yet, he didn't run from it anymore. He faced it. In those silent hours, Pete began to write again, not for others this time, but for himself. He filled page after page with fragmented thoughts, memories, lessons. Some entries were tender, others brutal in honesty. I used to think pain was weakness, one line read. Now I know it's a teacher. In another, he wrote, I used to lead men with fear. Now I understand I never led anyone, I controlled them. That's not leadership. That's insecurity with a gun. He no longer glorified the past. He dissected it. The same analytical mind that once mapped out territories and hierarchies now mapped the terrain of his own mistakes. He recognized patterns, the same pride that made him powerful had made him reckless. The same discipline that made him feared had made him cold. And yet, those same traits, if shaped differently, could have built something beautiful. It was a truth that stung but also liberated him. Through his correspondence, Pete had begun exchanging letters with social workers, journalists, even a few college students studying criminology. Some of them wanted advice, others simply wanted to understand. He never sugar-coated his responses. You can't understand the streets by studying statistics, he wrote in one letter. You have to understand the fear, how it seeps into everything. You have to understand how young men confuse respect with survival. One particular correspondent stood out, a young woman named Maya, a sociology student from the Bronx who was writing her thesis on gang culture and rehabilitation. Her letters were sharp, curious, but respectful. She didn't idolize him like others sometimes did. She questioned him. Challenged him. "Do you think redemption is possible for someone like you?" she asked in one letter. Pete had stared at that question for hours before replying, "Redemption isn't a clean thing. It's not about forgiveness. It's about responsibility. If I can use my story to stop someone else from becoming me, that's as close as I'll ever get to it." Their exchange continued for years. Through Maya's letters, Pete found a bridge back to the world he had once disconnected from, a world of thought, compassion, and growth. She would tell him about changes in the Bronx, the new murals, the community gardens, the kids playing in spaces that used to be war zones. The transformation of his old neighborhood was both comforting and bittersweet. The sound view he had ruled was gone, but maybe it was supposed to be. Maybe that was the truest sign of progress. Pete also began reflecting on his family, people who had endured his choices in silence. His mother, now elderly, had always written faithfully. Her letters carried warmth and forgiveness he didn't believe he deserved. "You were my boy before you were anyone's leader," she once wrote. That line broke something in him. He realized how deeply the pursuit of control had distanced him not just from others, but from himself. For years, he had hidden behind his myth, even to those who loved him most. Now, with nothing left to prove, he began writing back to her, not as Pistol Pete, but as Peter. The tone of his letters softened. He asked about family gatherings, about nieces and nephews he'd never met. He sent words of advice and love instead of warnings. His mother told him she read his essays and shared them at church, where people prayed for him every Sunday. "You're still changing lives, baby," she wrote once. He didn't cry often, but that letter drew quiet tears he didn't wipe away. Even the guards noticed his shift. They saw a man who carried himself with dignity, who helped younger inmates navigate their rage, who spent his hours reading and writing instead of scheming or trading favors. Some of them began calling him Professor Pete. It was half joke, half respect. He didn't mind. In a way, it fit. His cell had become a classroom, his story the lesson plan. He began teaching others about emotional control, about how to use silence as strength. "The world will always try to provoke you," he told one inmate. "Your reaction decides your prison, not these walls." These small sessions became informal gatherings, men sitting in circles, talking not about crimes, but about choices, fears, and losses. In that environment, Pete wasn't just rehabilitating himself, he was reshaping the culture inside. And yet, despite all this inner transformation, Pete never deluded himself into thinking he was free. He understood his reality completely. His crimes had taken lives and shattered families. The punishment, in his mind, was not unfair. He didn't ask for pity, nor did he dream of release. What he wanted now was to leave a mark that countered the destruction he had caused. In the rare moments of quiet reflection, he imagined walking through Soundview one last time, feeling the sun on his face, hearing the hum of children's laughter, the music of the Bronx alive again. He didn't long for power anymore, he longed for peace. The same peace he'd once mistaken for weakness. One night, after writing for hours, Pete closed his notebook and whispered to himself, "Maybe the streets never change, but people can." It was the kind of line that would have sounded naive to his younger self, but now it carried truth. He'd seen it in the men around him, in the kids who'd chosen school over gangs because of his letters, in the students who'd written back saying his words made them think differently about leadership and pain. Outside the prison, whispers of clemency petitions and sentence reviews began circulating. Some people believed that men like Pete could never truly change. Others argued that his case proved transformation was real. Pete stayed silent through it all. He wasn't seeking freedom, he was already freer than he'd ever been. In his own quiet way, Pete Rollack had begun transcending his story. The boy from Soundview, the warlord of the Bronx, the prisoner in solitary, all of them were parts of the same evolution. The legend had faded, but the man had finally emerged. And though the world still remembered him as Pistol Pete, within those steel walls, he was no longer defined by the gun. He was defined by reflection, by redemption, by a peace that had taken him a lifetime to find. The warlord had finally laid down his weapon, not out of defeat, but understanding. There are moments in life when time feels like it folds in on itself, past and present merging into one quiet awareness. For Pistol Pete Rollack, those moments came more often now. Sitting alone in his narrow cell, the hum of fluorescent lights above and the echo of footsteps in distant corridors, he would drift between memories of the Bronx and the rhythm of his new reality. It wasn't regret that filled him anymore, it was recognition. Every choice, every consequence, every scar on his soul was part of the same map. He was no longer trying to erase the past. He was trying to understand what it all meant. By the time Pete had spent over 2 decades behind bars, something profound had happened. The legend outside had softened into a story people analyzed rather than feared. Journalists, filmmakers, and students treated his life like a symbol, a case study in leadership, urban decay, and psychological transformation. Some painted him as a tragic hero, others as a cautionary villain. But few truly understood the human being behind it all, the man who spent his nights not plotting power, but studying humility. Inside the prison, word spread of his influence. Younger inmates sought him out not for protection, but for perspective. They would approach quietly during recreation hours, hesitant at first. Pete didn't talk about glory or toughness. Instead, he talked about fear, the invisible engine that had driven nearly every decision he made as a young man. Fear, he told them once, is the loudest voice in the streets. It whispers to you that if you're not feared, you'll be forgotten. But that's a lie. Fear fades. Respect lasts longer. Those conversations became rituals. Men who had never trusted anyone began opening up. They spoke of their childhoods, their mistakes, their pain. Pete listened more than he spoke, his silence carrying a strange authority. In a world built on violence, listening became his new weapon, a way to disarm egos, to build trust where none should exist. In that same period, Pete began participating in something unexpected, restorative justice dialogues. These sessions were rare, experimental efforts where offenders were allowed to read letters from victims' families, not to excuse, but to acknowledge. Pete's facilitator asked if he wanted to take part. He hesitated for weeks. The thought of facing the ripple of his actions terrified him in a way no gun ever had. But eventually, he agreed. The first session was brutal. He sat across from a counselor as she read aloud a letter from a woman whose brother had been killed during a gang confrontation linked to Pete's organization decades ago. Her words were steady, but heavy with grief. She spoke about the night she got the call, about the years of emptiness that followed, about her mother's silence that never lifted. Pete didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. He just listened. Every word was a mirror held up to his past. When it was over, he whispered, "I can't ask her to forgive me. But I hope one day, she finds peace I couldn't give her." That night, he didn't sleep. He replayed every name, every face, every moment that had been lost because of choices made in the pursuit of control. But instead of collapsing under the weight, he wrote. Page after page, he wrote letters he would never send, letters of apology, of understanding, of sorrow. They weren't performative, they were confessions to the universe, a way of saying, "I know what I've done." It was the first time he truly felt accountable, not to the system, but to humanity. The following weeks, something inside him shifted again. The anger he once used as fuel now had nowhere to go, and slowly it dissolved into clarity. He began meditating each morning, sitting cross-legged on his cot, focusing on breath, on stillness. The same focus that once sharpened his instinct for survival now turned inward, revealing depths he had never explored. He found unexpected peace in routine. The scrape of the breakfast tray, the echo of keys, the faint laughter of guards in distant hallways, all of it became part of the rhythm of his acceptance. Some nights, he would stare at the thin rectangle of sky visible from his window, watching clouds drift by. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Pete, it was a glimpse of eternity, a reminder that even the smallest window could hold endless possibility. Around this time, the prison chaplain began visiting him. The man was soft-spoken, patient, and never pushed faith. He spoke to Pete about morality, grace, and choice. Even a man who's done harm, he said one afternoon, can still do good by the truth he leaves behind. Pete didn't argue. He simply nodded. Truth, he realized, was the only thing he had left to give. He continued writing his essays, now compiled by a volunteer outside the prison who ran an outreach blog called Voices of the Forgotten. His writings reached thousands. Teachers used them in classrooms. Counselors printed them for youth programs. The essays didn't glamorize anything, they stripped everything down to raw lessons: ego, pain, loyalty, loss. In one essay titled The Weight of Silence, Pete wrote, "When I was on the streets, I thought noise made me powerful, the shouting, the threats, the gunshots. But real power is quiet. It's being able to sit with yourself and not run from what you hear inside." That line spread far beyond prison walls. It was quoted in articles, shared on social media, even used in a spoken-word performance by a Bronx poet who dedicated her piece to him. Pete learned about it months later when someone mailed him a clipping. He smiled, not out of pride, but gratitude. His voice, once used to command violence, was now helping others understand peace. Still, there were moments of deep loneliness. Transformation didn't erase isolation. Sometimes, when the nights grew long and his body ached from years of confinement, he would wonder how different things could have been. Not in a self-pitying way, but as a kind of mental exercise. If he had chosen school over the corner, patience over pride, would he still have found power? Would anyone have listened to him then? He often concluded that power itself wasn't the problem, it was what people sought to prove with it. "The streets don't give you power," he once wrote, "they lend it to you, until they decide you've had enough." As he neared middle age, the younger inmates began calling him Old Head Pete, a title of respect reserved for those who had survived long enough to gain wisdom. He didn't mind the label. In fact, he embraced it. His face had aged, lines deepened by stress and reflection, but his eyes remained sharp. When he spoke, people still listened. But now, his words healed more than they harmed. The prison staff began documenting his contributions to mentorship programs, noting measurable declines in disciplinary incidents in his unit. Counselors praised his empathy. Even the warden acknowledged him quietly one day, "Rollack, you've done more to keep peace in here than some of my own officers." Pete simply nodded. He didn't seek praise. He just wanted the time he had left to mean something. As the years stretched on, Pete found solace in the smallest details: the creak of old pipes, the smell of rain drifting through the ventilation, the hum of the world continuing outside. The Bronx was still out there, alive and changing, no longer defined by the violence that had shaped his youth. He didn't need to return to know it was healing. In a way, knowing that was enough. One evening, after lights out, Pete whispered a thought into the darkness, a thought that felt like both prayer and closure: "If the streets taught me fear, then these walls taught me peace. And maybe that's balance, the kind I never knew I was chasing." The warlord of the Bronx had found stillness not through dominance, but surrender. In the silence of a concrete cell, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the rhythm of redemption, Pistol Pete had finally learned what true power was: the power to change, to forgive, and to let go. The years had begun to blend together, marked not by calendar days but by moments of quiet realization. For Terrence "Pistol Pete" Rollack, the transformation did not happen overnight, it came slowly, like a sunrise inching over the Bronx skyline. Somewhere between the endless days and sleepless nights, he realized that power, the very thing he had once worshipped, had turned to dust in his hands. In his early years behind bars, Pete had resisted change. He still carried the pride of a warlord, the instinct to command respect with a glance. But time has a way of stripping away illusions. The violence that once seemed natural began to feel empty. The younger inmates who idolized his name reminded him too much of his past self, angry, reckless, and lost. He started to see them not as soldiers, but as broken reflections. One evening, after a tense encounter in the yard, Pete returned to his cell and sat in silence. A question echoed in his mind: if I keep being the man I was, what do I leave behind? That night, he opened a worn notebook and began to write. The words were shaky at first, admissions of guilt, fragments of memory, and questions that had haunted him for years. That single act became his ritual. Writing allowed him to face the ghosts he had buried beneath pride. As weeks turned to months, his notebooks filled with reflections, lessons learned, regrets confessed, and truths spoken aloud for the first time. The streets don't raise kings, he wrote once. They raise survivors who mistake pain for power. Those lines later circulated among inmates, copied and shared like gospel. Without meaning to, Pete had become a teacher. The prison staff noticed the change before he did. He no longer raised his voice, no longer moved with aggression. Instead, he began volunteering for literacy programs, helping others write letters home. Some men hadn't written in years, they had forgotten how to express anything but anger. Pete showed them how to tell their stories. Start with your name, he'd say softly. It's the first thing you ever owned. Word spread fast. Men from other units began requesting to join his sessions. The warden took notice and approved a weekly writing circle led by Pete himself. It wasn't about grammar or structure, it was about honesty. Inmates shared their stories, sometimes through tears, sometimes through silence. Pete never judged them. Every page is a new start, he reminded them. You just have to keep writing. Outside the prison, his letters began reaching the Bronx. Community workers, teachers, and journalists started reading them aloud in youth centers. His reflections, once private, became messages of warning and hope. One letter opened with the line, "Don't let the world trick you into thinking that fear makes you strong. It only makes you lonely." That sentence hit home for many who had grown up idolizing him. Former gang members began reaching out, some visiting the facility to meet him face to face. They no longer saw Pistol Pete the gangster, they saw Terrence Rollack, the man who was trying to rewrite his own ending. Despite the growing recognition, Pete remained humble. He didn't seek redemption for praise, he sought it for peace. In a rare interview with a journalist, he said, "I spent half my life trying to control people. The other half, I'm trying to understand them." Maybe that's what freedom really is, understanding. The warden, impressed by his progress, began to support his rehabilitation work. He allowed Pete to record short audio messages for youth outreach programs. His calm, gravelly voice carried a mix of warning and wisdom. If you think being feared makes you powerful, remember this: I'm feared no more, and I've never felt stronger. Inmates started calling him the professor. What began as teasing soon became a title of respect. Even the toughest men sought his advice. Pete listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. Violence is easy, he'd say quietly. Growth is hard. That's why most men never do it. One of his proudest moments came when the prison allowed him to start a small mentorship program. He called it Seeds of Change. It focused on 3 principles: self-reflection, education, and empathy. Each meeting ended with the same phrase, written on a chalkboard in his hand: "You are not who you were, you are who you choose to be next." Outside, the Bronx was changing too. The same neighborhoods that had once glorified Pistol Pete now used his story as a lesson. Murals began appearing, not of a gun-toting kingpin, but of a man in prayer, eyes closed, hands open. Beneath one mural were the words, "Even the hardest hearts can heal." One night, Pete sat in his cell after a long day of teaching and thought about that mural. He pictured the colors, the light, the kids who would pass it on their way to school. A quiet smile crept across his face. "If my name can keep one kid out of the life I lived," he whispered, "then maybe all this time was worth it." As he drifted to sleep, the air outside carried the faint sound of rain against the bars, a sound he'd come to love. Once, it had reminded him of confinement. Now, it sounded like cleansing. The warlord of Soundview was gone. What remained was a man rebuilding himself from the inside out, a man no longer feared, but finally understood. And in that quiet transformation, Terrence "Pistol Pete" Rollack discovered something he'd never found on the streets: purpose. Winter settled over the Bronx like a long sigh. In the gray silence beyond the prison walls, snow blanketed rooftops and buried the echoes of sirens that once defined the streets. Inside the facility, the air was heavy and still, each sound magnified, the slow hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of boots on concrete, the distant clang of steel doors. But in cell 23, there was something different. Terrence "Pistol Pete" Rollack sat in stillness, surrounded by notebooks and prayer cards, his face calm, his energy steady. For years, Pete had been rebuilding himself from the inside out. The man who once commanded armies of hustlers now woke before dawn to meditate, pray, and write. His mornings began not with noise but with breath. Each inhale was a step away from the warlord he had been, and each exhale a move closer to peace. The transformation hadn't been sudden, it had been slow, quiet, and painful, the kind of change that required breaking before healing. He had stopped asking for freedom. The parole hearings, the appeals, all of it had faded into background noise. "If the walls are my world," he once told a chaplain, "then I'll make peace my neighborhood." Word of his transformation spread through the prison system. Younger inmates sought him out for advice, not about crime or survival, but about purpose. They gathered in the yard during recreation hours, forming a loose circle around him. Pete would sit on a bench, voice low and steady. He never preached. He just told stories, about mistakes, consequences, and the strange beauty of waking up one day and deciding you're done destroying things. "The streets will never love you back," he said once. "They'll feed you till you're full, then swallow you whole." That line became a mantra among the men who listened. It appeared scribbled on notebook covers, tattooed on arms, whispered in hallways. Even the correctional officers noticed. Rollack's crew, they called them jokingly. But it wasn't a gang, it was a quiet rebellion, a circle of men learning to think differently, to breathe differently, to live differently. Meanwhile, beyond the bars, the Bronx itself was changing. The streets that once bore his name in graffiti were now dotted with murals of peace, education, and community rebuilding. His story, his transformation, had reached the youth centers and schools that had once feared. Even mentioning him. A short documentary circulated online, From War to Wisdom, The Pistol Pete Redemption. It showed his letters, read aloud by former gang members now working in mentorship programs. His words resonated deeply: redemption isn't freedom. It's responsibility. It's the work you do when no one's watching. Back inside, Pete spent long hours in reflection. He wrote about faith, about guilt, about the strange beauty of regret when it becomes fuel for something good. He often returned to a single sentence that he rewrote again and again: "The cage didn't break me, it stripped away everything that wasn't real." One day, the warden approached him with a proposal to formally establish a mentorship initiative within the facility, using Pete's method of journaling and guided discussion. They called it Project Second Breath. Pete agreed immediately, though he made one condition: it wasn't to be about him. "If my name's on it, it should stand for change, not for history," he said. The program flourished. Within months, fights decreased, tension softened, and inmates began writing their own reflections. The notebooks filled with stories of regret, forgiveness, and hope. Pete collected these writings and compiled them into a small booklet titled Letters from the Inside. When the first batch was printed, he smiled, holding one copy in his hands as if it were proof that something pure could still grow from concrete. During those days, Pete began corresponding with community leaders in Soundview. One letter from a youth director moved him deeply. It read, "We tell the kids your story, not to glorify the violence, but to show that even the darkest life can find the light." Pete reread it several times, his fingers tracing the words. For the first time in decades, he felt truly seen, not as the legend, not as the warlord, but as the man trying to make things right. When summer arrived, a small miracle occurred. The Department of Corrections granted permission for the community center to visit the prison and speak with Pete via video conference. On the day of the call, a large screen flickered to life in the visiting hall. On one side sat a group of children and mentors, on the other sat Pete, in his standard-issue khaki uniform, his hands folded neatly on the table. A young boy, no older than 14, asked the first question, "Mr. Pete, do you miss the streets?" Pete smiled softly. "Every day," he admitted. "But I don't miss what I did there. I miss what they could have been. I miss what we could have been if we'd chosen better." Another child asked, "If you could change one thing, what would it be?" Pete paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd listen more. To my mother. To my fear. To my own silence. Most of us get lost because we never stop to listen." When the call ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, on either side of the screen. The Soundview director wrote later, "It was like hearing a storm apologize to the sky." That evening, Pete sat on his bunk, staring out through the narrow slit of his window. The sun was setting, streaking the sky with deep red and gold. He felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood, a sense that, finally, the war inside him had ended. He opened his journal and wrote what would become one of his most quoted lines, "You can't erase your sins, but you can rewrite your story." And that's what he had done. Slowly, patiently, and with the same intensity that once fueled his rage, Pistol Pete Rollack had rewritten his story, not for fame, not for absolution, but for the next soul who might find his words and choose a different path. As night fell, the prison lights dimmed, and the world outside quieted into a hush. Pete closed his notebook, exhaled, and whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the Bronx. For the children who would never know his name in fear, but perhaps, one day, know it in peace. In that silence, he realized that his greatest rebellion had never been against the system or his enemies, it had been against the darkness within himself. And for the first time in his life, he knew he had won. The years passed quietly, and Terrence "Pistol Pete" Rollack's name began to carry a different weight. Inside his cell, the man once feared as the Bronx Warlord had become a mentor, a calm voice among chaos. He spent his days reading, writing, and speaking with younger inmates who reminded him of himself at 16, angry, lost, and searching for belonging. He no longer spoke of power or loyalty, only of truth. The hardest man, he often said, is the one who forgives himself. Those who listened would leave his cell changed. Guards noticed it too, fewer fights, fewer shouts, more peace. It was as if Pete had turned prison into a classroom for redemption. Outside, Soundview began to heal. The corners that once echoed with gunfire now hummed with laughter. Murals of Pete appeared on walls, not glorifying the violence, but honoring the transformation. His story was now being taught in youth centers, not as a warning, but as proof that even the hardest lives could soften. Late at night, he wrote in his journal, "I used to rule the Bronx with fear. Now I teach it to breathe again." In the stillness of his small cell, Pete finally found what years of war had never given him, peace. He had become a legend not for the blood he spilled, but for the lives he helped rebuild. By the time spring returned, Pete's health had started to fail. His body weakened, but his mind remained sharp, filled with quiet wisdom. He spent long hours by his window, watching sunlight shift across the bars. Even in here, he said once, you can still find a sunrise. He continued mentoring until his voice grew hoarse. Younger inmates gathered around his bunk for evening talks about life, choices, and forgiveness. His words carried a calm rhythm, less a sermon, more a heartbeat. Pain's a teacher, he told them. Peace is the graduation. News of his transformation had reached beyond the prison walls. His letters were read in classrooms and community centers across the Bronx. One child drew a picture of a man behind bars watering flowers, captioned, "Even bad people can make good things grow." Pete smiled when he saw it. "That's the whole story right there," he whispered. In his journal, he wrote one final line that year, "The man I was built walls. The man I am plants seeds." Those seeds, his words, his lessons, his peace, were already growing across the Bronx. Summer came softly, and with it, the last chapter of Pete's life. His voice had grown weak, but he agreed to one final interview, a chance to leave his truth behind. Seated by his window, sunlight warming his face, he spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "They still call me a gangster," he said, "but they forget the man I became. I used to chase power, now I chase peace. If I'd known it felt like this, I'd have chased it from the start." That line became famous across the Bronx, printed on murals and quoted by youth mentors. For the first time, his name inspired hope instead of fear. Inside, he continued to teach, even as pain took over. When a young officer asked him how he kept going, Pete smiled softly. "Because if I stop now, I undo everything I learned." He wrote a final message to the people of Soundview: "Don't follow my path, rewrite it. Be strong enough to stop the cycle." By the end of that summer, Pete was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, the proof that redemption, once found, could outlive even the hardest heart. Autumn came quietly. The leaves outside his window turned gold as Pete's strength faded. He no longer feared death, it felt more like coming home. On his final morning, he whispered to the chaplain, "Tell the Bronx I'm free." Those were his last words. When news of his passing reached Soundview, people gathered beneath his mural, lighting candles and leaving flowers. His son stood among them, silent but proud. For the first time, the Bronx mourned not a gangster, but a man redeemed. Weeks later, his journals arrived at the community center. They were bound and published under the title "Peace from the Inside." One line became immortal: "Real strength isn't being feared, it's being remembered for your peace." The corner where his gang once ruled became Rollack Garden, filled with murals and laughter. Kids played where soldiers once stood. His story lived on in classrooms and in the hearts of those who believed change was possible. And so, the man who had once ruled the Bronx with fire left behind something greater than power. He left peace. His life closed like a calm whisper, a reminder that even in darkness, things still grow.